Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Wednesday, everybody. We begin with developments in US-China relations. Yesterday, US President Biden and Chinese General Secretary Xi Jinping had a phone call, their first conversation since their November summit. The call kicks off a new round of high-level bipartisan diplomatic engagement, as we will soon see. US-based veteran China analyst Bill Bishop observed on the phone call that, quote, reading the respective readouts, you might be excused for thinking that the two leaders were on different calls. End quote. The PRC readout, as usual, is much longer than the White House official statement and a bit more declarative. Interestingly, Bishop explains, the Chinese readout lumps Taiwan and, quote, trade and technology suppression measures, end quote, in the same paragraph. Quote, likely a signal that after Taiwan, those measures are the issues of most concern to Xi and his team, end quote. A very telling observation. Bishop adds that, quote, the tech controls especially must be causing some real discomfort, and I think the PRC side is rightfully concerned about further possible restrictions on technology exports, end quote. We will discuss this shortly. The US readout said Biden raised concerns over the PRC's support for Russia's defense industrial base. US-based Wall Street Journal cites a White House official as saying, quote, as time has gone on, we've really seen the PRC start to help to rebuild Russia's defense industrial base, end quote. Biden also wanted to get Xi to help curb the attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea by the Houthi forces of Yemen. The Biden administration has pressed China to ask Iran to rein in the Houthis, especially since Chinese ships also pass through the Red Sea. Biden also voiced concern ahead of Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's visit to China this week over what the US sees as Chinese unfair trade practices. We will cover this soon too. TikTok was also raised as a topic. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby told media, quote, the president reiterated our concerns over the ownership of TikTok. He made it clear to President Xi that this was not about a ban of the application, but rather our interest in divestiture so that the national security interest and the data security of the American people can be protected. End quote. Just before this phone conversation, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan spoke with his counterpart in the Philippines. According to the White House readout of the conversation, the two discussed preparations for the visit of Philippine President Marcos to the White House and the historic Japan-Philippines-US Trilateral Leaders Summit, which, as we discussed earlier this week, will likely see the announcement of greater military cooperation between the three powers in the South China Sea. The White House readout continues, quote, following the PRC Coast Guard and maritime militia's dangerous actions on March 23rd, obstructing a lawful Philippine resupply mission to Second Thomas Shoal, Mr. Sullivan underscored the ironclad U.S. alliance commitments to the Philippines under the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, which extends to armed attacks on Philippine armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft, to include those of its Coast Guard, anywhere in the South China Sea, end quote. Meanwhile, today, Wednesday, begins U.S. Treasury Secretary Yellen's week-long visit to China. According to the U.S. readout, she will meet with Premier Li Qiang, Vice Premier He Lifeng, and former Vice Premier Liu He. One of the areas which she seeks to underscore, according to the official readout, is the, quote, global economic consequences of Chinese industrial overcapacity, end quote. It is worth discussing industrial overcapacity here. China's industrial overcapacity and the frictions it is causing in its trade relations overseas is a big topic which we've been following closely on China Update. Beijing has become sensitive to this too. State-run Xinhua published a special national commentary this week called Hidden Agenda Behind Hype of China's So-Called Overcapacity Problem, pushing back against what the US, the EU, India, Japan and others have all told China is a deep concern. The Xinhua piece writes, quote, while China bashing is nothing new in the West, a new target of the incessant firepower has emerged of late, China's manufacturing capacity. While it is just basic economics that surplus products naturally seek out markets elsewhere once domestic demand is met, and Western nations have been doing that for centuries, when it comes to China, it becomes an overcapacity problem threatening the world. The double standard here is glaring. So is the West's calculations behind it. This new variant of the China threat theory is just a pretext for certain Western countries to poison the environment of China's domestic development and international cooperation and take more protectionist measures for their own industries. End quote. Peking University Professor of Finance Michael Pettis, who we quote often on China Update, has long warned that China's industrial overcapacity, a feature of its imbalanced growth model, where households subsidize industry resulting in weak demand which is externalized, would cause a global backlash, which we are now seeing. He has also pointed out that while China's economic output is approximately 20% of the global rate, consumption is less than 13% and manufacturing is about 30%. This, he argues, is politically unsustainable. And indeed, this week, UK-based The Financial Times writes that in private conversations with their Chinese counterparts, quote, American economic officials have warned Beijing that the US and its allies will take action if China tries to ease its industrial overcapacity problem by dumping goods on international markets. End quote. This week, Mary Gallagher, director of the International Institute and professor of political science at the University of Michigan, provided a useful explanation of what makes China's overcapacity stand out. Quote, while excess capacity has an economic definition related to the lack of hard budget constraints, China's propensity for excess capacity has always been more severe compared to other state socialist regimes that also had soft budget constraints. China's overcapacity is also not just about the overproduction of things, such as EVs, toasters, steel, cement, or solar panels. In PRC history, there are many examples of how the system encourages excess. I relate this not to soft budget constraints, but to campaigns and a mobilization top-down style of governance. This fosters intense competition between localities and firms. China's ability to generate competition internally is a very important but somewhat underappreciated aspect of its governance, because traditionally we think of planned economies as the lack of competition, markets. Even during the Mao period, the China model yielded competition, sometimes tragically, as in the Great Leap Forward when localities competed for grain production, lying about statistics and sending far too much grain to the cities. But in the reform period, the Hukou system bottled up rural surplus labor for decades until rules were finally relaxed to allow for internal migration to jobs in manufacturing, construction and services. This excess supply of labor fueled China's miracle growth for decades. After 2008, the export crash led the government to invest in infrastructure and the real estate sector. This fueled overcapacity in many sectors and products. The clean-up has only just begun, and this new shift to advanced manufacturing and exports is seen as the best solution to the problem by China's leader, even though many internal and external advisors push for domestic reforms and redistribution. This passes off the problems to foreign markets and further delays China's reckoning with domestic reform. End quote. Next up, let's stay on US-China and discuss technology, and then we move to Taiwan. But first up, I wanted to discuss a matter just quickly here. Regular viewers have already heard this before, but it's worth repeating. I appreciate that some viewers find the provocative nature of thumbnails and titles a bit of a turn-off. I also dislike them. Indeed, if you look back in time, the first almost 2 years of the channel had very neutral-looking thumbnails, and I wish I could just use these plain thumbnails and titles going forward. Unfortunately, YouTube demands that minimum click-through rates are met, otherwise the channel is punished. I have experimented a few times now with more sober thumbnails, and these have resulted in approximately 60 to 80% reductions in views, with YouTube even not showing the videos to subscribers who have hit the notification button. As such, I've had to lean into the more provocative thumbnails and titles. However, despite this, my promise is that the content in the videos themselves will always remain sober, grounded, and fact-based. I hope that you can appreciate and understand the situation I am in, and I myself appreciate that understanding. With that said, let's move through the rest of the video. If you're enjoying today's video or getting some value from it, hitting the like and subscribe buttons is a huge help. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description below for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. I rely primarily on your support to keep going, so this of course is also a big help. Thank you so much everybody, as always, for the ongoing support. Let's continue. As I mentioned previously in the video, it does look like more technology controls against China from the US are coming. UK-based Reuters has reported that the US is asking allies to stop domestic companies from servicing certain chip-making tools for Chinese customers, and that the United States is drawing up a list of advanced Chinese chip-making factories barred from receiving key tools. The Netherlands is a key country in all of this, and yesterday US-based outlet Politico reports that more details have emerged over Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte's, please forgive my pronunciation, that probably is not right, meeting with Xi Jinping in Beijing last week. Quote, "Xi clearly warned Rutte against erecting tech barriers," in a reference to the Netherlands' decision to side with the US to impose bans on microchip machine maker ASML's sale to China. Chinese officials, including Premier Li Qiang, were keen to test where the Dutch red line was, asking in not-so-equivocal terms whether they would be willing to keep servicing existing machines already sold to China. However, Rutte tried hard to be diplomatic and stick to non-committal responses, according to officials briefed on the matter. End quote. Meanwhile, US-based Bloomberg reports that American officials want South Korea to restrict the flow of equipment and technologies for making high-end logic and memory chips to China. Quote, "Those include logic chips more advanced than 14 nanometer and a type of memory called DRAM beyond 18 nanometer. End quote. As we saw with the PRC readout of the Biden-Xi conversation we started today's video with, these technology controls seem to be causing significant concern in Beijing. Next up, and finally for today, US-based The Atlantic Council and Rhodium Group have a new report on how the PRC may respond to US and G7 sanctions in the event of a crisis over Taiwan. The report is an interesting and sobering read. We end today's video by examining selected excerpts from the report, which we are now quoting directly. Beijing has watched carefully as Western allies have deployed unprecedented economic statecraft against Russia over the past 2 years. This report examines China's ability to address potential US and broader G7 sanctions, focusing on its possible retaliatory measures and its means of sanctions circumvention. We will find that reciprocal economic statecraft measures would exact a heavy financial toll on the G7, China itself, and the global economy. Crucially, however, we also find that China is developing capabilities that are making its economy more resilient to Western sanctions. We cover the use of economic statecraft tools in two main scenarios: a moderate escalation over Taiwan limited to the United States and China that remains short of military confrontation, and a more severe scenario where G7-wide restrictions targeting Chinese firms and financial institutions. We arrive at 7 key findings. 1. China's economic statecraft toolkit is quickly expanding. In the past 5 years, China has used a range of formal and informal statecraft tools, including tariffs, import bans, boycotts, and inspections, to punish firms and countries for their stances on Taiwan and other sensitive issues. 2. China's statecraft toolkit is heavily weighted towards trade and investment rather than financial statecraft. We assess that in a moderate scenario where US exports to China are curtailed, more than $79 billion worth of US goods and service exports, such as automobiles and tourism, would be at risk. In a higher escalation scenario involving G7-wide sanctions against China, around $358 billion in G7 goods exports to China could be at risk from the combination of G7 sanctions and Chinese countermeasures. On the import side, we estimate that the G7 depends on more than $477 billion in goods from China, which could be made the target of Chinese export restrictions. Regarding investment, at least $460 billion in G7 direct investment assets would be at immediate risk from the combined impact of G7 sanctions and retaliatory measures by Beijing. By comparison, China has limited financial tools available to directly influence G7 economies. What restrictions China imposes on capital outflows are likely to be driven by the financial stability concerns rather than attempts to coerce. 3. China will face steep short and medium-term costs if Beijing deploys economic statecraft tools. China would face high economic and reputational costs for using economic statecraft tools, especially in a high escalation scenario. While export restrictions would be one of China's most impactful economic statecraft tools, it would also be among the costliest option for China. Over 100 million jobs in China depend on foreign final demand. and nearly 45 million of these jobs depend on final demand from G7 countries. China may prefer to avoid tit-for-tat retaliation for strategic reasons. As a result of the major costs to its citizens, China is unlikely to follow a tit-for-tat approach, but will target sectors where it can inflict asymmetric pain, particularly through the use of export controls or trade restrictions on critical goods such as rare earths, active pharmaceutical ingredients, and clean energy imports, e.g. graphite. 5. China will likely attempt to divide the G7 and therefore limit the impact of sanctions. 6. China is seeking to create resiliency to sanctions by developing alternatives to the dollar-based financial system, including renminbi-denominated transaction networks. Renminbi-based networks are never likely to replace the US dollar-dominated global financial system. However, the gradual expansion of these networks can help Beijing find alternative mechanisms for maintaining access to financing and trade transactions, even in the event of far-reaching Western sanctions or trade restrictions. 7. The timing of any crisis can significantly alter the impact of statecraft tools for both the G7 and Beijing. Western efforts to de-risk and shift supply chains in the next 5 years may reduce Beijing's second strike statecraft capacity over time. At the same time, China's renminbi-based financial networks will expand in scope and liquidity, providing Beijing with more options to mitigate Western sanctions. Here ends the direct quote of the report and today's episode of China Update. Let me know what you thought of some of these developments in the comments below. The question of whether China has overcapacity in its industrial sector and how this is affecting its relations with the rest of the world is a particularly fertile ground for good conversation, so I'd be interested to know what you think. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching today's episode of China Update. Have a wonderful Wednesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.